can I go on to number 1?
Yes, sure.
So number 1, please give me a short introduction about yourself and BL.
So hello, my name is Natalia Rogaczewska and I am Head of Public Affairs at BL. And BL is the National Federation of so-called social housing organizations in Denmark. It is my job to represent the political interests of our members. So our members are the social housing organizations. And I represent them towards the politicians in the Danish parliaments. We look into our legal framework. Does it support our mission and our goals? And this also covers actually our international work, since I also represent BL and the Danish social housing organizations at the European and the Nordic umbrella organizations for affordable housing as well. So I have been working in BL since 2012. And before that, I worked as a special advisor to the Minister of Business Affairs. And I myself have also lived in social housing in Denmark twice for a total amount of about 10 years.
I'll move on to question number 2.
Mm-hmm.
How would you define social housing? Is there any legal or official definition in Denmark? Are there any different terms?
So in Denmark, we actually don't use the term social housing, because if you translate almene boliger more directly, it actually means common housing, because it is for everyone and it is a fundamental part of the Danish welfare society. So we have a legal definition in our own law, which is the social housing law, so to say. And the legal purpose of social housing in Denmark is that the purpose of social housing organizations is to provide decent housing for all in need hereof at a reasonable rent and to give residents influence on their own living conditions. So as you can hear, this also means that our social or common housing is non-profit. So you could also call it this, you could call it non-profit housing. Because the rent covers what it costs to build and operate the homes. And this also means that the rent is cost determined and not market determined. I guess that you could say that in Denmark, the social housing term is opposite to what social housing is in other countries. So compared to other countries where social housing is for the socially most vulnerable or economically most vulnerable people, this is quite the opposite meaning of social housing in Denmark. It is social because it is for everyone.
So I'll move on to the next question, number 3. The proportion of social housing in Denmark is 3rd highest in EU. Since when and how did Denmark have such a large share of social housing?
So public housing has existed in Denmark for more than 100 years, but only after World War II has the number of social housing really started to grow. In the 40s, we had around 15,000 homes. Then in the 1950s, around 80,000. In the 60s, more than 100,000, 70s, more than 200,000, 80s, more than 300,000. And in the 90s, 425,000 homes, and up until today, where we have more than 500,000 homes. But as you can hear, it was especially in the 60s and 70s and 80s that we were building many, many new homes. And then you could ask, why has Denmark been so successful with such a strong expansion in social housing or common housing or non-profit housing in the last half century? This was primarily due to the fact that social housing was not just for the socially most disadvantaged, as I said before. It is for everyone. And then on the other hand, after the period of Second World War, we had a housing shortage, which was also, I think, in the rest of the world, and especially in Europe. And as the economy recovered and growth and welfare rose actually quite sharply in the 60s in particular, but also in the following decades, there was still a shortage of housing for all. So the market was actually not providing enough housing. And therefore, a very important part of Danish welfare policy, but housing policy specifically, was to support the social housing sector. So we got more housing quickly and not at a too high price. In order to increase the pace of construction, we had various laws that were passed so that the construction process could be made more efficient, and that construction was made cheaper and faster, more effective. This is one of the reasons why Denmark actually became one of the world leaders in prefabricated construction. The kitchen elements that we know today was developed in this area. We had before that individual carpenters making the kitchens in the individual flats, but during this decade we developed prefabricated kitchen elements, for example. So there is also quite a large industrial and growth story and success hidden in this area. So we had these large building parts. They were made at the factory and they were transported to the construction site. So we see that history is repeating itself with the European Commission looking into construction and especially the social housing sector to help the European economy recover from the economic impact that the COVID-19 virus has had. And in Denmark, during this highly productive social housing construction times, legislation also followed and ensured that the social housing sector, as it became a more and more important part of the housing market, actually became more self-financing. So we were moving away from state subsidies towards a self-financing system and model that we have today.
I got it now. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll go on to number 4.
Yes.
A lot of Koreans consider houses as the means of investment, making money, rather than the means of dwelling. So Koreans buy a house in a very cheap price and then wait for it to go up. So how do people in Denmark interpret housing? Is it quite different or similar?
But in Denmark, like in most other countries, there is also a tendency towards home ownership. And we can also see that most people, when they can afford it, choose to buy their own flat or house. However, what I can say is that I don't think that there is the same amount of social status linked to home ownership as I have experienced in other countries. You will also see directors or politicians living in social housing in Denmark or in rental homes. And in general, there is not a lower social status, so to say, connected to renting as opposite to owning your house. It is very normal that you rent a social house during or in the private rental sector, and many elderly people actually also sell their own house after they retire, and then, for example, move into a social housing home in order to relax and enjoy their life after the kids have moved out.
And move on to number 5. Unlike other countries, social housing scheme is open to everybody on application in Denmark, so there is no limitation to who can apply. Doesn't the system result in too many people waiting on the list who want to live in private rental housing?
You are right. There are long waiting lists for social housing in Denmark, But this only seems to be an issue in the bigger cities, I have to say. So we have long waiting lists in the bigger cities, and of course, mainly in the capital, Copenhagen. This also means that even though everyone can live in social housing, in reality, where there is not enough homes, the stock is occupied by the people who have the biggest need. By law, the municipalities are disposing, they have a disposal right over every fourth available social housing dwelling. And they need this disposal right, and they use it also to accommodate the most needy people, so the most vulnerable people. And actually also, if you look at the reality numbers in the bigger cities, the disposal right is also higher than every fourth. It's more than 25%. It can be up to almost 35%. So a lot of people decide to live, a lot of the people who decide to live in private rental housing are also, of course, the people who can afford it.
So since anyone can get a social housing unit regardless of income, do social housing stock in Denmark maintain social mix? If not, why? Are there any prejudices against social housing?
But I think that in general, there is no prejudices against social housing as a sector in Denmark. We have a better social mix in general, I think, than in many other countries, because our housing sector is for all. Young people, elderly, families, disabled people, and so on live together. However, as I said before, in some areas, especially around the bigger cities, the dwellings are used for people who need it the most. And this, of course, also means low-income people, people who are not employed, or families who struggle otherwise, economically or socially. We also house, quite a lot of people with mental troubles. But there are also a few housing areas in Denmark, of course, that have challenges. And unfortunately, these are known or called so-called ghettos. But these areas only amount to 4% of the total social housing stock in Denmark. Unfortunately, there was a broad political agreement passed in 2018, which means that each December 1st, a list is made of social housing areas in Denmark that are put on a so-called ghetto list and a hard ghetto list. And the criteria to get on the list are different socio-economic criteria, like, for example, amount of people in the area with below a certain income level or educational level, amount of criminal convictions, and also level of employment. And housing areas who get on the hard ghetto list have to decrease the amount of family dwellings in that particular area with 60%. So that is quite a lot. And for us, it doesn't make any sense, especially since we need good quality and affordable housing now more than ever. So our worry is that in time, this law will create actually a worse social mix and more so-called ghetto areas, because there will be fewer and fewer social housing homes if we have to decrease the amounts in these areas. But at the same time, we foresee that there will be more and more people needing affordable housing. So we are quite worried about this.
Number 8, who are the main providers of social housing in Denmark? There could be public agency, non or limited profit providers, cooperatives, individuals, etc.
Yes, so all social housing dwellings or homes in Denmark are actually provided by social housing organizations, and they are all structured legally and organization-wise in the same way. So they are legal entities, but they are not owned by anyone. And as I said before, they are non-profit providers. They are regulated very strictly by law, the social housing law, but they are not public entities. They fall under the legal terms actually of being associations in Denmark. And this is also linked to the fact that the tenants have a very strong influence. We have in Denmark what we call within the social housing sector, the tenant democracy. So tenants are, they vote, they elect boards in their housing areas, and these boards elect representatives who are then represented in the social housing organization. And actually this goes all the way up to BL's board, so the board that I have to that I am secretariat for. So there is a very strong tenant influence, and the tenants decide on the local budget. They decide on maintenance. So do we want service to cut our grass in our housing area twice a month or 4 times a month? Because this reflects, of course, the costs. So the tenants have influence on that. They decide on whether you can have pets or not. So I think that this is also quite unique in Denmark, that we have a very strong and legally secured tenant influence in the social housing sector.
Okay, so I think we could end our interview here.
Perfect.
Perfect.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening. Yeah.
Have a nice day.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.